The cyclic AMP cycle, or the cyclic AMP mechanism, is a process in which a signal can cause some sort of a change within a cell. That change could be chemical, it could be behavioral, it could be physical, but it all starts off with this signal. Now, remember that the signals received by a cell can come from various sources. It could be an endocrine signal from a hormone that travels all throughout the body. It could be a paracrine signal, which means a signal coming from a neighboring cell. It could be an autocrine signal, which means that the cell itself released the signal and receives it itself as well. Or it could even be a neuronal signal coming from our neurons. But what we have to understand is that the signal will come to a receptor on the periphery of our double-layered cell membrane. So remember, we have a bilipid membrane, and we have various receptors on our membrane. For this mechanism, we're specifically concerned with the G protein coupled receptor. If we break down this word, we can understand that this is a receptor, and it's coupled with a G protein. Over here we can see in green we have a receptor, and we have a G protein, and this G protein is bound to a GDP molecule. Now, more commonly, we may have heard of ADP and ATP. GDP is essentially similar. The only difference is that we have a different nucleotide. In ADP, we have adenine diphosphate. Over here, we're talking about guanine diphosphate. So we still have two phosphates, we're just changing that nucleotide. So on this G protein, we have GDP, and we receive a signal. The signal will bind to the receptor, and it will cause a change over here in this complex of the G protein and GDP. So essentially what happens is that when that signal binds, it's going to cause the G protein to lose the GDP and gain a GTP. So what's the difference? Well, GDP has two phosphates, GTP has three phosphates. That's the only difference. So when this G protein gains that GTP, the G protein becomes activated and it will release itself from that receptor that it was bound or coupled to. So once again, we get a signal, GDP is lost, GTP is attached, and the G protein is released. So the G protein will be released and it'll move through the plasma membrane and come to another structure molecule called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase is also found on our plasma membrane. And when our G protein GTP complex binds to adenylate cyclase is able to catalyze the reaction of ATP to cyclic AMP. So we have cyclic AMP. So what's the difference between ATP and cyclic AMP? First of all, this is adenine triphosphate, so we have three phosphates. And here we have adenine monophosphate, so we have one phosphate. So essentially we're losing two phosphates. We went from ATP to cyclic AMP, adenine 1 monophosphate. So when adenylate cyclase catalyzes this reaction and we get cyclic AMP, we can actually use this cyclic AMP to catalyze another reaction of going from inactive protein kinase 1 to active protein kinase 1. Now, a protein kinase, well, first of all, it's a protein. That means it's made up of amino acids. Second, it's a kinase, and a kinase transfers a phosphate group, and usually an ATP molecule is utilized. Now, a protein kinase 1, once it becomes activated, it can go on to phosphorylate enzymes or molecules to cause the effect that the signal was wanting to cause. So if we start off from the top again, we can understand that this signal, it couldn't directly cause the effect itself. Instead, it used this secondary pathway with these secondary molecules to cause some sort of an effect in the cell that was required. So once again, the signal binds to the G protein coupled receptor. GDP is lost, GTP is gained, the G protein becomes activated and is released. This complex then binds to adenylate cyclase, and adenylate cyclase is able to catalyze the reaction from ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is then able to catalyze the reaction of inactive protein kinase 1 to active protein kinase 1. And active protein kinase 1 can go on to phosphorylate further molecules and cause the effect the signal wanted to create.